The cold wind howled through the empty roads as Max, the German shepherd, limped forward, his paws torn, his body aching. 50 miles lay behind him. But ahead, the unthinkable awaited. The road stretched endlessly before him, the cold asphalt biting into his torn paws. Every step sent a jolt of pain through his weary body, but Max kept moving. He had no choice. His golden-brown fur was matted with dirt, his once powerful frame reduced to little more than skin and bone. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his heart. Somewhere beyond the horizon, past the fields and winding roads, his home awaited. His human awaited. Max was no ordinary dog. He was a German shepherd, bred for intelligence, loyalty, and strength. But more than that, he was a companion, a protector, a soul bound by an unbreakable connection to the man who had raised him. That man was Daniel Carter. A former Marine, Daniel had known the horrors of war and the emptiness of coming home to a world that no longer felt familiar. The battlefield had taken so much from him. His brothers in arms, his sense of purpose. But when he found Max as a puppy, abandoned in a rain-soaked alley, something inside him changed. He saw a reflection of himself in the small, shivering creature, lost, alone, searching for something to hold on to. Daniel took Max home that night, wrapping him in an old military blanket, whispering promises into his ear. "You're safe now, buddy. I got you." From that moment on, they were inseparable. Their days were filled with training, long hikes through the woods, early morning runs where Max kept pace beside Daniel, his ears perked, his eyes always scanning for danger. Max wasn't just a pet. He was a soldier in his own way, attuned to Daniel's every movement, every shift in emotion. He could sense when the nightmares came, when the weight of memories grew too heavy for his human to bear. On those nights, Max would press his warm body against Daniel's side, grounding him, bringing him back to the present. Life in their small town had been simple, peaceful. Daniel worked as a mechanic, fixing old cars in the garage behind their house. Max had his routine: morning patrols through the neighborhood, afternoons lounging in the yard, evenings curled up at Daniel's feet. But life had a cruel way of unraveling the things that mattered most. It started with a phone call. Daniel's father had fallen ill, a sudden, devastating stroke. The hospital was hours away, and time was slipping through his fingers. In the rush of the moment, Daniel made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. He left Max behind. Just for a little while, he had told himself. Just until he could figure things out. A neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had agreed to watch over him. She was kind, an elderly woman with a soft spot for animals, but she wasn't Daniel. She didn't understand the depth of Max's devotion, his sheer, unwavering belief that they belonged together. The first night without Daniel, Max sat by the door, ears alert, waiting. He didn't sleep, didn't move. He simply waited, confident that his human would return. The second night, he paced, whining softly, his restlessness growing. By the third night, something inside him snapped. Daniel was gone, and Max had to find him. He didn't know how far, didn't know the dangers that lay ahead. He only knew one thing: his human was out there, and he was going to bring him home. The journey begins. Max had no way of understanding distance or direction in the way humans did, but he had his instincts, a powerful force woven into his very being. He knew Daniel's scent better than his own, and it was that scent he would follow, no matter where it led. The night he made his escape, the world was wrapped in a blanket of darkness. The moon cast long shadows over the quiet neighborhood as Max nudged the back gate open. Mrs. Henderson had been careful, but not careful enough. The latch was loose, and with one determined push, Max was free. The cold air carried 1,000 scents: fresh grass, damp earth, the distant trace of smoke from a nearby chimney. but Max ignored them all. He lowered his nose to the ground, searching, sifting through the layers of aroma until he found the one he was looking for. Daniel. It was faint, nearly lost beneath the scents of other people, other places, but it was there. A thread of familiarity in a chaotic world. Max followed it. At first, the journey was easy. He knew the streets of the town well, the places where he and Daniel had walked together. But as the night stretched on, the town faded behind him, replaced by long, empty roads and vast fields that stretched endlessly into the horizon. He had never been this far before, but fear had no place in his mind, only purpose. Days passed. Miles disappeared beneath his aching paws. Max learned the rhythm of survival on the road. He drank from puddles, scavenged for scraps near gas stations and roadside diners. Some people shooed him away, others tossed him half-eaten sandwiches or scraps of meat. A truck driver took pity on him once, offering a piece of jerky. But when he tried to grab Max's collar, the German shepherd growled low in his throat and backed away. No one could take him. No one could stop him. His only mission was finding Daniel. The nights were the hardest. Cold and lonely, the darkness stretched forever. The stars above indifferent to the suffering below. Max would curl up beneath trees, in ditches, anywhere that offered a sliver of shelter. But sleep never lasted long. The moment he closed his eyes, memories would flood his mind. Daniel's voice, his laughter, the warmth of his touch. And so Max would rise again, pushing forward, step after agonizing step. 50 miles. That was how far he had traveled. Through rain and wind, through hunger and exhaustion, 50 miles. And still, he had no idea what awaited him at the end of his journey. But Max didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Because Daniel was out there. And Max had made a promise the day he was taken in from the cold, wrapped in a blanket, and told he was safe. A promise he would never break. The sun was setting when Max finally reached the edge of a busy highway. The roar of passing cars sent shivers through his exhausted body, but he didn't hesitate. His paws ached, his legs trembled beneath him, but his mission was clear. He had followed Daniel's scent this far, and he would not stop now. The road ahead was a blur of motion. Bright headlights streaking through the darkness, tires screeching on wet pavement. The smell of burning rubber, gasoline, and fast food wrappers clashed with the fading trace of Daniel's scent, making it harder to focus. Max hesitated for the first time in his journey, his sharp mind working through the problem. This was not like the quiet neighborhood streets where he and Daniel used to walk. This was dangerous. But Daniel was out there. A horn blared as Max took a step forward, wind whipping through his fur as a truck thundered past, missing him by inches. He leapt back, his heart hammering, his breath coming in ragged pants. He had to be smart. He had to find a way across. A break in the traffic. A pause. Max sprinted. His muscles burned. His claws scraped against the pavement. Another car swerved, tires screeching. A voice shouted, but Max barely heard it. He reached the other side, his chest heaving, his body shaking from adrenaline. The danger had passed, but his journey was far from over. A town that wasn't home. As the last traces of daylight faded, Max found himself in a town unlike the one he had left behind. This place smelled of damp concrete, of trash left too long in the sun, of food that was both tempting and rotting at the same time. Neon lights flickered along the streets, casting eerie glows against the brick buildings. Voices, laughter, the clinking of glass, sounds of people, but not Daniel. The scent trail led him deeper into the city. Max moved through the alleyways, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow, every face. A group of stray dogs lurked near an overturned trash can, their eyes wary as Max approached. They were lean, desperate, their ribs pressing through thin fur. One of them, a lanky mutt with a torn ear, let out a low growl, warning him to stay away. Max ignored them. He wasn't here to fight. He padded further into the streets, slipping through the maze of human life. A woman sitting on a stoop noticed him, her cigarette glowing in the dim light. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, reaching into a brown paper bag. She tossed him a piece of bread. Max sniffed it, but moved on. His hunger was nothing compared to his purpose. Then, a scent. Familiar, faint, but real. Daniel. Max's head snapped up, his ears rigid, his nose working furiously. He turned, tracking the scent, weaving through the streets, past an open-air market, past a man sweeping the sidewalk, past a group of teenagers laughing loudly on a corner. The scent was getting stronger. He was close. The door that stood in his way. Max followed the trail to a narrow alley where the scent pooled like a memory clinging to the walls. He pressed his nose against the cold bricks, inhaling deeply. Daniel had been here, recently. The realization sent a surge of energy through his tired body. Then he saw it. A door. It was old, wooden, with chipped red paint and rusted hinges. The scent was strongest here, as if Daniel had walked through it not long ago. Max's tail lifted, his body tense with anticipation. He let out a sharp bark, then another, scratching at the door. Nothing. Silence. He barked again, a desperate plea. Still nothing. A flickering light from a street lamp cast long shadows across the alley. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on Max. He backed away from the door, staring at it, willing it to open. His body trembled. He had come so far. Where was Daniel? His ears twitched. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Max spun around just as the alley filled with light. A car had turned the corner, its headlights illuminating the space between him and the door. The vehicle rolled to a slow stop, the engine humming low. Then, the door creaked open. Max's heart pounded as a man stepped out. It wasn't Daniel. This man was older, hunched, his gray hair disheveled. He reeked of sweat and stale beer. His bloodshot eyes landed on Max, and he scowled. "What the hell are you barking at, mutt?" Max growled, his hackles rising. The man took a step forward. "Go on! Get out of here!" He waved a hand, as if shooing away a stray cat. Max didn't move. His mind was screaming. Daniel was here. He was here. The man muttered something under his breath, then turned back toward the door. Max lunged, teeth bared, his bark sharp, demanding. The man cursed, kicking out with one heavy boot. Max dodged just in time, his ribs still aching from the road, but he didn't retreat. He barked again, his body rigid with frustration, desperation. Daniel. Where was Daniel? But the door slammed shut, and Max was left standing in the darkness. The cruel reality. He didn't move. For the first time in his life, uncertainty settled into his bones. He had followed every instinct, every memory, every trace of scent that whispered Daniel's name. And now, he was here, at this door, in this strange place, alone. What had gone wrong? His breath came in slow, uneven puffs. His legs trembled, his body exhausted beyond measure. He lowered his head, pressing his nose to the ground, searching, hoping, praying for some sign. Nothing. And then, the rain started. It came suddenly, heavy drops pounding against the pavement, soaking into his already dirty fur. The cold seeped through him, biting at his aching muscles. The alley, once full of promise, now felt like a prison. Max curled up against the wall, his ears flicking back as the storm raged overhead. He would not leave. He could not. Because Daniel was close. He had to be. The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the alleyway into a river of filth and broken dreams. Max lay curled against the cold brick wall, his fur drenched, his breath shallow. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but his mind refused to surrender. Daniel had been here. He knew it. The thought alone was enough to keep him from closing his eyes, even as exhaustion threatened to drag him under. Lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening crash of thunder. The city was alive with noise. Cars splashing through puddles, voices shouting through the downpour, distant sirens wailing in the night. But in the alley, Max was alone. Waiting, watching, hoping. The red door stood silent and still, a barrier between him and the one person in the world who mattered. The scent was there, faint now, almost lost in the wetness of the storm, but it was real. Daniel had passed through that door. But why hadn't he come out? Max's thoughts twisted in restless circles, fighting against the exhaustion fogging his mind. Had Daniel abandoned him? Number impossible. Max had been left before, back when he was just a shivering puppy on the streets. But Daniel had saved him, had wrapped him in warmth, had promised he'd never be alone again. Daniel wouldn't break that promise. Would he? A deep, aching whine escaped Max's throat before he could stop it. His body shuddered. The rain had soaked through to his skin, the cold burrowing into his bones. He needed shelter, food, warmth. But none of that mattered. Not without Daniel. Then, movement. Max's ears snapped forward, his body instantly alert despite his exhaustion. Footsteps, heavy and sluggish, echoing from inside the building. The red door creaked. A sliver of dim yellow light split through the darkness. Max pushed himself up, every muscle protesting, his heart pounding as he braced himself. And then, the old man again, the one who had kicked him. He stepped out, muttering under his breath, fumbling with a cigarette. He barely spared Max a glance before lighting up, the tip glowing bright against the night. Max growled low, deep in his chest. The man exhaled a long plume of smoke and glanced down at him, frowning. "Still here, huh?" Max's tail was stiff, his body tense, ready. "Daniel! Where is Daniel?" The man took another drag, shaking his head. "You ain't gonna find what you're looking for, mutt." Max didn't understand the words, but the tone sent a cold wave of unease through him. Something was wrong. The man let out a sigh and flicked the cigarette to the ground, crushing it beneath his boot. "Stupid dog," he muttered. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared back inside, slamming the door behind him. Darkness swallowed the alley once more. Max stood frozen, staring at the door, his heart hammering. What did that mean? Why wasn't Daniel coming out? A low, frustrated whimper slipped past his lips. He could feel something slipping. Hope, certainty, time. He had to find another way. A city of shadows. Max turned from the door, his ears flicking back against the storm as he forced his tired legs to move. The city stretched before him, unfamiliar, chaotic, filled with strange smells and dangerous sounds. But somewhere in that city was Daniel, and Max would not stop until he found him. He moved through the streets like a ghost, silent and determined. His paws left wet prints on the pavement, his fur dripping, his stomach hollow with hunger. The neon lights of shop windows reflected in his tired eyes as he passed diners, gas stations, liquor stores, places where humans gathered, but not Daniel. The rain softened into a steady drizzle, the storm moving further into the night. Max pressed forward. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep going. Then, a scent. Not Daniel, but familiar in another way. Food. His instincts screamed at him to follow. He hadn't eaten in days, had barely rested, and his body was beginning to fail him. He needed something, anything, to keep going. He followed the scent down another alleyway, past dumpsters and broken crates, until he reached the source. A small restaurant, its back door propped open, warm light spilling onto the wet pavement. Max crept closer, his nose twitching, his ears perked. The smell of roasted meat, of bread, of something rich and warm and life-giving filled his senses. Then, a voice. "Hey, get out of here!" Max barely had time to react before something came flying toward him. a tin can clattering against the pavement, rolling to a stop near his feet. A man stood in the doorway, apron stained with grease, his face twisted in irritation. "I said get lost, mutt." Max flinched but didn't move. He was too weak, too tired. The man sighed and glanced over his shoulder. Then, grumbling, he grabbed something from inside, a half-eaten sandwich, wrapped in wax paper. "Here," he muttered, tossing it toward Max. "Now scram." Max hesitated only for a second before lunging for it, his stomach twisting with hunger as he devoured the food in 3 quick bites. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep moving. Enough to keep searching. Daniel was out there. He had to be. A faint, familiar whisper. The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving. Max wandered, his body screaming for rest, his mind racing with desperation. But then, a whisper, a scent. Daniel, faint, almost lost beneath the city's chaos, but real. Max's heart leapt. He turned sharply, following the scent down another street, then another, past blinking streetlights and sleeping storefronts. Stronger now, closer. And then, a voice. A voice he knew better than his own heartbeat. "Easy, man. I'm just looking for a place to crash for the night. No trouble." Daniel. Max's body moved before his mind could catch up. He bolted forward, dodging between parked cars, his legs burning with renewed energy. There, in the glow of a street lamp, Daniel stood. His face was bruised, his clothes wrinkled, his hair damp from the rain. He looked exhausted, talking to a man outside of a rundown motel. Max didn't care about any of it. All that mattered was that he was here. With a broken, desperate whine, Max surged forward, closing the distance between them in seconds. Daniel turned, his tired eyes widening in disbelief as the massive, soaking wet German shepherd barreled toward him. Max? And then, impact. Max hit Daniel with everything he had, knocking him backward, his paws scrambling at his shoulders, his tail wagging so hard it nearly threw him off balance. He whined, whimpered, buried his face against Daniel's chest, his entire body trembling with relief. Daniel's arms wrapped around him, holding him tight, his breath shaking. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Max, how?" Max didn't care about the questions, didn't care about the how, the why, the where. Daniel was here, and that was all that mattered. Daniel pressed his forehead against Max's, his hands gripping his fur as if afraid to let go. "You found me," he whispered. "You crazy, incredible dog. You found me." Max let out a long, slow breath, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. He had done it. He had found his way home. And no matter what came next, he would never leave Daniel's side again. The world around them faded into a blur of city lights and the hum of distant traffic. For a moment, it was just Max and Daniel, locked in an embrace that spoke of pain, loss, and an unwavering devotion that had defied impossible odds. Max's body trembled from exhaustion, but his tail thumped against the wet pavement, his heart hammering in his chest. He had made it. He had found Daniel. Nothing else mattered. Daniel pulled back slightly, his hands still gripping Max's soaking fur. His face, once hardened by the weight of life's cruel turns, was now softened by something fragile. Disbelief, relief, maybe even guilt. His blue-gray eyes darted over Max's thin frame, taking in every rib pressing against his skin, every wound etched into his paws. "Jesus, Max," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What happened to you?" Max whined, pushing his head into Daniel's chest as if trying to tell him everything in a single motion. The endless roads, the hunger, the cold, the desperation. He had fought the entire world to get back to him. Daniel swallowed hard, running a shaking hand over Max's head. "You walked all this way, didn't you?" Max's deep brown eyes met his, unblinking, unwavering. Daniel let out a long, uneven breath. His fingers dug into Max's fur, his grip desperate, as if afraid that if he let go, his best friend would vanish like a ghost. "I'm so damn sorry," Daniel choked out. "I should have never left you." Max let out a soft huff, leaning into Daniel's touch. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment. Only love. Only trust. Daniel shook his head, exhaling sharply. "Come on, buddy, let's get you inside." The man he had been speaking to, the motel clerk, cleared his throat. "You know that dog?" Daniel wiped a hand over his face, still shaken. "Yeah," he muttered. "He's mine." The clerk eyed Max, then shrugged. "Well, you better get him out of the rain before he collapses." Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He wrapped an arm around Max's body, guiding him toward the rundown motel. Every step Max took was slow, labored, his body on the verge of shutting down now that his mission was complete. Inside, the motel room was dimly lit and smelled of mildew and cheap cigarettes. The walls were stained with time, the furniture worn and threadbare. But to Max, it didn't matter. He was with Daniel. Daniel grabbed a towel from the small bathroom, kneeling beside Max on the creaky wooden floor. "Let's dry you off," he murmured, running the rough fabric over Max's soaked fur. His hands hesitated over the cuts and bruises. "God, you look like hell, buddy." Max didn't care. He closed his eyes as Daniel worked, relishing in the warmth of his touch, the familiarity of his scent. When Daniel finally sat back, his brows furrowed, a deep frown set into his face. "You didn't just wander here, did you?" he muttered. "You tracked me." Max blinked up at him. Daniel let out a dry, almost disbelieving laugh. 50 miles, he whispered. "You walked 50 miles to find me." Max simply watched him, his deep brown eyes full of something pure and unshakable. Loyalty. Daniel ran a hand over his face again. "I don't deserve you." Max huffed softly, nudging Daniel's arm with his nose. Daniel sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I messed up, buddy. I thought leaving was the only way to fix things." He shook his head. "I never meant to leave you behind." I swear Max's ears twitched, as if listening. Daniel exhaled, his voice almost a whisper. "I thought if I left town, I could figure things out, that I could get my life together. I didn't realize—" He looked down at Max, his eyes glassy. "I didn't realize you'd come after me." Max shifted closer, pressing his body against Daniel's side. He didn't care about the past. He didn't care about the mistakes. He had found his human. That was all that mattered. The unseen danger. For the first time in days, Max allowed himself to rest. The bed creaked under Daniel's weight as he sat beside him, his fingers absent-mindedly running through Max's fur. Then, a knock at the door. Daniel stiffened. Max's ears perked instantly, his muscles tensing. The knock came again, louder. Daniel rose to his feet cautiously, his jaw tightening. "Who is it?" Silence. Then, "Open the door, Carter." Max's fur bristled. That voice. It belonged to the man from the alley, the one who had slammed the red door in his face. Daniel cursed under his breath. His eyes darted toward the window, his body shifting as if weighing his options. Max didn't understand everything, but he knew one thing. Danger was close. Daniel's hand rested briefly on Max's head. "Stay." But Max didn't stay. As Daniel cracked the door open, Max was already on his feet, his body coiled, ready. The old man stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Behind him, another figure lurked in the shadows. Taller, broader, his presence exuding something dark. "You've got some nerve showing up here," the old man grunted. Daniel exhaled sharply. "I'm not looking for trouble." The taller man stepped forward, his face partially obscured by the dim light. "Then you shouldn't have left town with unfinished business." Max let out a low growl, stepping beside Daniel. The taller man's gaze flicked to him. That your dog? Daniel's fingers curled into a fist. Yeah. A slow smirk stretched across the man's face. Loyal thing, ain't he? Daniel's jaw tightened. What do you want, Sam? The name sent a ripple of unease through Max. Sam chuckled. You owe me, Carter. Daniel's shoulders tensed. I don't owe you anything. Sam's smirk faded. That's so? His eyes flickered toward Max. Shame. Would have been easy to settle things. Max didn't understand the words, but he knew a threat when he heard one. His body went rigid. His growl deepened. Sam chuckled darkly. Guess we'll have to do this the hard way. Then, he moved. Everything happened in an instant. Sam lunged. Daniel barely had time to react before fists flew, bodies colliding. Max sprang forward, his teeth flashing, his instincts roaring to life. He hit Sam hard, knocking him off balance, snapping his jaws inches from his arm. The old man swore, stumbling back. Call your damn dog off! Daniel grabbed Sam by the collar, shoving him backward. Stay away from us! Max's chest heaved, his stance unyielding. His eyes locked onto Sam with a ferocity that made even the hardened man hesitate. Then, without a word, Sam straightened his jacket, exhaling sharply. This isn't over. Daniel wiped blood from his lip. It is for me. A long silence. Then, with a final glare, Sam turned on his heel and disappeared into the night. The old man hesitated a moment longer before following. The second the door shut, Daniel exhaled heavily, his hands still trembling. Max stood firm, his gaze never leaving the door. Daniel ran a shaking hand through his hair, then turned to Max. I don't know what I'd do without you, buddy. Max let out a short, steady breath. Neither did he. But he'd never have to find out. The motel room felt impossibly small, the silence stretching between them like an invisible wall. Outside, the rain had eased into a light drizzle, tapping softly against the window. The neon sign of the run-down building flickered, casting a faint red glow across the damp carpet. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed. His hands rested on his knees, his fingers curled into loose fists. Max lay beside him, his body still aching, his paws sore and cracked. But he didn't care. He was here. He had found Daniel. The exhaustion in Daniel's face was something Max had never seen before. Not like this. His human had always been strong, unshakable. But now, there was something else in his eyes, something fragile, guilt, regret. And yet, when Daniel reached out, hesitantly running a hand through Max's damp fur, the warmth was still there. The connection. The bond that time and distance had not been able to sever. You're crazy, you know that, Daniel murmured, his voice hoarse. 50 miles, buddy. 50 damn miles. What were you thinking? Max didn't move, didn't answer, at least, not in words. Instead, he pushed his head into Daniel's lap, pressing as close as he could. Daniel inhaled sharply, his hand tightening in Max's fur. I don't deserve you, he whispered. Max let out a quiet huff, the sound soft but full of understanding. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers absently scratching behind Max's ear. I screwed up, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought leaving was the only way to fix things, that I could outrun everything, my mistakes, my past. I thought I was doing the right thing. Max's ears twitched, but I wasn't, was I? Daniel let out a dry, humorless laugh. Because you came after me. Max lifted his head, locking eyes with him. Daniel swallowed hard, shaking his head. You're all ribs, buddy. You haven't eaten, have you? Max wagged his tail weakly. Daniel rubbed a hand down his face. We need to fix that. He stood, grabbing his jacket. Let's get out of here. Max pushed himself up, his legs shaky beneath him. He felt the weight of exhaustion press down on him, but he didn't care. Wherever Daniel went, he would follow. Daniel glanced down at him, his brows furrowed in concern. You okay, boy? Max's tail wagged again, slower but steady. Daniel sighed. Come on, let's go home. The drive home. The night air was cool as they stepped out of the motel. The streets glistened with rain, reflecting the distant glow of streetlights. Daniel helped Max into the passenger seat of his old truck, his hands careful as he lifted him in. Max curled up instantly, his body too tired to do much else. Daniel started the engine, letting it rumble to life. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the steering wheel. His jaw clenched. His fingers tightened around the worn leather. Then he exhaled, shaking his head. He glanced over at Max, who was watching him through half-lidded eyes. You never gave up on me, did you? Daniel murmured. Max let out a soft sigh, resting his head against the seat. Daniel swallowed hard. I don't know what I did to deserve you, buddy. Max didn't move. He didn't need to. Daniel reached out, resting a hand on Max's back. His touch was warm, steady, a silent promise. Then he put the truck into drive, pulling onto the wet pavement. They drove in silence, the hum of the engine steady, rhythmic. The city lights faded behind them, replaced by the open road. Max's eyes drifted shut, the exhaustion finally winning. But for the first time in days, he felt safe. He was going home. A promise rebuilt. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the sky. The deep indigo of night melted into soft hues of violet and gold, casting a gentle glow over the landscape. Max stirred, blinking sluggishly as the familiar sights of home came into view. The old gas station, the diner where Daniel used to take him after long walks, the winding roads that led to the place they had always belonged. Daniel pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the house. The porch light flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the worn wooden steps. It was the same as he had left it, the same as Max had left it. Daniel exhaled slowly, then turned to Max. Ready, buddy? Max lifted his head, his tail thumping lightly against the seat. Daniel smiled, small, tired, but real. He stepped out, moving to open the passenger door. Come on. Max moved carefully, his legs still stiff, his body still weak. But as soon as his paws hit the ground, he knew. This was home. The scents were familiar. The air was lighter. He was back. Daniel led him inside, flipping on the light. The house smelled the same, wood and dust, faint traces of motor oil from Daniel's garage. The couch was still covered in an old, worn-out blanket. Max's bed, untouched, sat in the corner of the living room. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Feels like forever, huh? Max padded forward, sniffing the air, taking it all in. Daniel disappeared into the kitchen, returning a moment later with a bowl of food and fresh water. Here you go, boy. Max barely hesitated before eating, his hunger finally catching up to him. Daniel watched him, his arms crossed, a quiet expression on his face. I thought leaving was the answer, he murmured. Thought I needed to figure my life out first. His jaw tightened. But you figured it out for me, didn't you? Max finished his meal and sat back, licking his lips. Daniel knelt down, resting a hand on Max's head. I left you behind. His voice was rough. And you still came for me. Max leaned into the touch, his eyes half closed. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. I won't do that again, he promised. I swear, buddy. Max let out a soft sigh, curling up beside him. And in that moment, everything settled. The past no longer mattered, because they were home, together. And nothing would take that away again. Morning crept over the horizon, casting golden light through the worn curtains of the small house. The world outside was waking up, birds chirping, distant cars rolling down the road, the hum of life beginning again. But inside, in the quiet warmth of home, Nothing mattered except the steady rhythm of breathing. One human, one dog, both finally at peace. Max lay curled near the couch, his body relaxed in a way it hadn't been in weeks. His paws twitched slightly in his sleep, his breaths deep and steady. He was safe. He was warm. He was home. Daniel sat nearby, sipping a cup of coffee, his gaze fixed on the dog that had walked 50 miles to find him. He still couldn't believe it. The sheer loyalty, the unwavering determination. "You're something else, buddy," he murmured, shaking his head. Max stirred at the sound of his voice, blinking groggily before lifting his head. His ears perked slightly, his tail giving a slow, contented wag. Daniel smiled, small, tired, but filled with something deeper now. "You're stuck with me now, you know," he said, setting his coffee down. "No more running, no more disappearing. I get it." He let out a slow breath. "I get it now." Max stretched, letting out a satisfied groan before padding over to Daniel. He rested his head on his knee, looking up at him with those deep, knowing eyes. Daniel chuckled softly, running a hand through Max's fur. Yeah, I know, you don't have to say it." The weight that had clung to Daniel for months, the doubt, the guilt, the feeling of being lost, felt lighter now, because Max had found him, had reminded him of what truly mattered: loyalty, love, home. And as Daniel sat there, running his fingers through the thick fur of his best friend, he realized something. Max had never given up on him, and he never would. Because love, true, unwavering love, wasn't something you could leave behind. It found you. No matter how far you ran, no matter how lost you were, it always found you. Just like Max had. Just like he always would. Final message to the audience. Max's story isn't just about a dog walking 50 miles to find his human. It's about something deeper, something we all long for. Unbreakable loyalty. The kind of love that doesn't waver, no matter the distance, no matter the hardship. Dogs don't care about mistakes. They don't care about past regrets. They just love. And sometimes, in a world that feels heavy and uncertain, that kind of love is exactly what we need to be reminded of. So tonight, when you see your dog curled up at your feet, when they look up at you with those trusting eyes, remember this: you are their world. And they would walk through storms, cross endless roads, and fight through exhaustion just to be by your side. Because to them, you are home. And home is forever. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who understands the bond between humans and dogs. And if you have a loyal companion by your side, give them an extra hug today. They deserve it.